So the first video we're going to do, or overall we want to do a video about setting a combine. We get a lot of questions throughout the year about different conditions, different crops, specifically to corn and soybeans, but you can get wet corn, dry corn, you can get tough soybeans, you can get soybeans that are dead ripe, and all of them may require a little bit different settings to the machine. So what we want to do is we're going to go over a lot of the things. We're going to do an infield session, and we're going to also talk about some of the initial adjustments or initial things that you need to do before the season even starts to make sure that your combine's ready to go.
Yeah, like Lucas said, our first video that we're going to do today, we're going to show you how to level a concave. That's very important to get that even threshing through the whole concave. When you get it unlevel, you might have a pinch point in there and you're actually grinding the crop more than you think you are, or you're going to have too big of a gap. You might not be threshing that corn off the cob like you think you should be.
So one thing on that, you go out to a machine and they've got their, say for corn, they go out and initially they set their concave to 30. Well, and that's a good starting point, but if your concave is not leveled and zeroed out, you might actually be on 40 or 45. I've gone out to a lot of machines with a complaint about threshing and harvest losses, and what you find is you get in there and you start looking at that concave. Well, when it's all the way closed, there's 10, 15, 20 millimeters of a gap between that rotor threshing element and those concave bars. So even though you think you might be actually on 30-inch or 30 millimeters for the gap, you might actually be on 40 or 45 or even 50. Even though just because that number on the monitor says 30, you got to make sure that this is leveled and zeroed to make sure that that actually is a meaningful number that you can actually go off of and use to set the machine.
That's right. So today we're going to show you how to do it. First thing you want to do is you want to take all the shields off of the side of the combine. Lucas already did that for us this morning. The next thing, we want to take a separator grate out. We take the separator grate out so we can spin that rotor when it's in neutral. I spin it in reverse rotation, so opposite of crop flow. That way when we are leveling and we do that tick procedure that we'll talk about, you hit that high spot of that threshing element first, and it gives you a truer tick than if you were going with crop rotation. When you first start to get that tick, when you go that way, the high point of the element will drag through and you won't hit it. So when you're going backwards, the high part of that element will hit the concave first, and then you can be able to audibly hear that a lot better.
So the first thing you want to do is to check and see, is my concave leveled and zeroed? What condition is that in? First thing you're going to want to do is up in the cab, you're going to go to your monitor and you're going to select your harvest settings, and you're going to want to run that concave motor all the way around to zero. Now that worm gear is going to come around over here on the back side, and we'll get a shot of that here, but that worm gear on that motor is going to come around, and you can see, I'll point to it here, you can see that it's come all the way around and it's actually hit this part. So that motor physically can't go any further, okay? That's the place where you want to be. Now, if this motor comes off or something like that, there's an additional safety stop that we'll talk about here in a second. But the first thing you want to do is you want to get that motor around to zero, to where it's come all the way around and it's actually touching to where it physically can't turn that any longer. Then you've got the motor all the way to zero to start with. So again, that doesn't mean that our concave's at zero yet. That just means we've got the motor completely bottomed out. So the next thing we want to do, like Chris said, we'll spin that rotor around, and you can reach in there and you can look at those threshing elements. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but I'm putting my fingers in between that threshing element and those concave bars, okay? I can get my complete finger in between that threshing edge, the very trailing edge of that threshing element. I can get my complete fingers in between that bar that on the concave and the trailing edge. Now, that gap is going to be a little bit different because that concave is not a perfect circle just like the rotor is. It is a little bit of an elliptical shape. So as that rotor comes around, it is going to open up a little bit more. So you're going to see a difference here on the side versus what it is down here at the bottom. So I usually check it at the bottom to start with to kind of give me an initial set, so I kind of know where I'm at. So I don't have the biggest fingers in the world, but if I can get them in between there, that's a minimum of probably 10, 13, maybe 15 millimeters where we are from 0. And what that means is if I've got my number set on 30 in the cab, if I run through the calibration procedure and I set it to 30, I'm actually either 40 to 45 millimeters on my concave setting rather than the 30 that I was trying to get. So as you can tell, that's going to probably impact how my combine performs in the field, because I don't have my concave set where I actually thought I had it set. So we're going to go through that procedure of what to do first. So the first thing you're going to want to do is I've got these stop bolts, and I've already got them loosened up. It's an 18 millimeter right here. You're going to loosen those stops. So this is that safety stop that I talked about. So just because that motor bottoms out, well, maybe somebody came out and replaced the motor or something like that and they moved, or you sheared a shear bolt and that didn't get oriented back correctly. Well, I want this safety stop here so that if that motor doesn't actually bottom out before that concave gets to 0, I want that concave to hit these safety stop bolts here. I want them to hit that to make sure that that concave doesn't get up into my threshing elements when I'm going through the field harvesting. Okay, that can cause a lot of damage and ruin some threshing elements, break concaves, things like that. So these are kind of my safety stop, and we'll set those when we get to completely done. But the first thing you got to loosen loosen these up so that I've got some travel so that I can manually adjust this concave to get it set to 0. So the next thing I'm going to do is I've got a set of double nuts here and a set of double nuts here. Okay, they're very difficult to get to when I have the concave all the way closed up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hop up in the cab. We'll pause the video. I'm going to hop up in the cab and I'm going to open that concave up probably to about 30 or so, just to rotate this rock shaft to where I can get to these jam nuts, and then we'll continue the video after that.
So Lucas opened up our concaves for us. Before we opened them up, we sprayed that worm gear with some multi-purpose spray, WD-40, whatever you got, just to help that motor not work so hard to go through closing and opening that, because we will be opening and closing it quite a bit here, going through this leveling procedure.
Now that's not something that you want to do while you're in the field just for this procedure, because you don't want it to collect dirt. You don't want it to collect dust and things like that, which will happen. But for this procedure, because we just have the key on, engine's not running, we're using a lot of battery and we're making that motor work extra hard. So that's why we go ahead and spray that worm gear down while we're doing just this procedure.
So next we're going to loosen up these jam nuts that Lucas had talked about earlier. There's 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top. We're going to loosen all 4 of the bottom nuts quite a bit, because the top nuts are what's holding our concave up. So we're just going to loosen those bottom ones, get them out of the way, and then we're going to loosen the jam nuts on the top.
Another tip to keep in mind while Chris is doing that is, if you know about how far you need to go, so when I could put my fingers in there, I estimated that was around 10 to 15 millimeters. That's how far you can back that very bottom jam nut off, and that'll give you an idea to know, okay, I'm going to back them off about that far. And then you can draw that concave up, run that concave back to 0 with the motor, and that should get you reasonably close at that point. At least you're going to be in the ballpark of where you need to be. Now, you're still going to have to fine tune it, but that's kind of a gauge to know how far to go initially.
So Lucas lowered the concaves for us, went through and broke all these jam nuts loose on the bottom, lowered them up about an inch, 3/4 of an inch, and then lowered the top jam nut on the bottom side that same amount. The concaves are held up by that top nut. The bottom one keeps them in place to keep them from bouncing when crop goes through the machine. So we can already lower those both down on both sides. And I also loosened the jam nuts on the top side of this concave hanger bolt. I loosened them up quite a bit, and then I went ahead and tightened up the concave bolts quite a bit, roughly a 1/4 inch on each side, because Lucas measured that gap earlier is about 1 finger width. So we would just want to speed that ticking process up. So we went ahead and raised that concave up. You want to do this procedure annually, or at least biannually, every other year, just depending on how many separator hours you put on the machine. This particular machine's got 550 roughly separator hours, and so we're going to do it this season. Just from crop wear, maybe the bolt stretch or something, Just needs to be done in every at least 100 separator hours or annually. All right, so Lucas closed the concaves back up. You can tell that because the worm gears bottom out on this gear here to adjust the concave on the rock shaft. I went ahead and spun the rotor a little bit in reverse just to make sure we're not ticking from when I cheated closing those up prior to closing the concave. So what we're going to do here is what we call the tick procedure. We're going to tighten the front hanger bolt up till we hear that tick when we're spinning that rotor in reverse. That tick is heard when that concave element is hitting the concave. So that threshing element hits that concave. And then we're going to back that bolt up 3 turns of that nut, 3 complete turns. And then we're going to go and tighten that back bolt up until it ticks and back it 3 turns again. So we want to do them each individually and get them close. That way, when you adjust it, there can be a big gap or maybe it gets hung up or something. So we're going to do both initially, and we loosen up quite a bit. And then we're going to do it again a second time to get that fine-tune adjustment. So after we do our tick procedure on the first time, we're going to tighten our bolts back up. We already know we're 3 turns back, so we're going to tighten it 3 more turns till we hear that tick, and then we're going to back it up 1 turn. And then we're going to do that again on that rear hanger bolt. We're going to tighten that nut up to get to the tick, and then we're going to back it up 1 turn. Doing it, that fine-tune adjustment allows our Z-bar, which is right here with the concaves bolt to get in place and make sure it's not hanging up on the front or rear bulkhead, just to help us get a true 0. So Lucas is going to get up here. I'm going to tighten him up. Lucas is going to spin that rotor in reverse. We're going to start in that front bolt. We're going to tighten it up to that till we hear that tick. Hopefully we can hear that tick on video. We'll really make it hit for you so you can hear it, but it might be too much. Just keep that in mind. So one more thing we went ahead and did to make access to these bolts a lot easier when it's concaves are closed. We took these 4 self-tappers out to hold that wiring harness up to the rail. So it's a 10mm socket, pulls those bolts out so we can get in there and really access these hanger bolts. Go around one more time, hopefully we can hear it. So that's a little heavier of a hit than we like, so we're going to back it up till it barely starts ticking. Went too far, it quit ticking, so we're just going to tighten it back up just a little bit. So if you heard that it's barely ticked, so now we know our front bolt's pretty close. We're going to take our Sharpie, we're going to mark our flat here on the pipe, on the adjustment, and we're going to loosen it up 3 full turns. All right, now we got our front bolt where we want for the first tick test. Now we're going to tighten our back bolt up. Lucas is going to spin that rotor in reverse again for us. So we hear that tick, that's a little too much, so we're going to back it off. Let Lucas keep spinning it. All right, so now we have a slight tick, so we're going to mark our rear bolt again and take it off 3 full turns. All right, we backed it up 3 full turns. Now we're going to, that allows that Z-bar to equalize in here. So now we're going to go back to the front. We're going to tighten that up that 2 full turns, and then we're going to slowly tighten it up that 3rd turn until we start hearing that tick again. All right, Lucas, you want to start turning it? So we go on 2 turns. We're already ticking. So our Z-bar was kind of in a bind when we loosened it up, so we're going to start slowly back it off. We don't hear that tick no more, so now we're going to loosen it up one full turn. My Sharpie mark's not where I got it, so I'm going to make another one and make a different mark so you don't get confused, and we're going to back it up one full turn. All right, we backed our front bolt up one full turn. Now we're going to cheat and tighten our rear bolt up. Already got 1.5 turns of free with my fingers because the Z-bar was holding itself up. So now we're going to slowly go till we start hearing that ticking sound. So we hear that tick, kind of too heavy of one, so we're going to back it up a little bit. So now we're not ticking no more. We're going to make another mark and we're going to back it up one full turn and then tighten down all our bolts. So we got our top ones, or backed it off of one turn. We're going to lock down our top jam nuts first. So we're going to hold the bottom nut and use our second wrench to hold our jam nut, or tighten our jam nut to our bottom nut. Kind of tight quarters, not the funnest job to do this, but very important for machine performance to do this procedure. So we got our top nuts tightened, jammed together. Now we're going to tighten our lower nut and the pipe that's above it, and we're going to squeeze it to the top two nuts. So we're really locking that rock shaft in place so it can't move. So got that bottom nut tight. Now we're going ahead and tighten our jam nut. All right, now that we got our concave hanger bolts tightened back up, we're going to go ahead and put our bolts in, hold our harness up, and then we're going to set our safety stops for our true zero.
Now, I want you to look at those safety stops. We'll bring the shot in closer. So I just barely broke that top jam nut loose. So you guys can see how much we've adjusted that concave, okay? So I barely broke that loose when I first started doing this. And then I backed off this lower nut here, okay? So now we've got our concave all the way to 0, and these safety stops are against this bracket, which is where we're going to want them at when we're all done. But notice up here how much that this nut is now above this bracket. So that gives you an idea of how much we move that concave to get it back to 0. So again, after approximately 2 seasons, this combine has had that much wear, or just, you know, the parts getting settled in and moving and getting settled into place. That much wear, that much settling of parts, movement of parts, those kinds of things, that's going to impact where you set your concave, okay? So if I was actually on 30, I was probably, looking at that gap, that's probably about a 13 millimeter gap. I was more like 43 if I was on that 30 for corn setting. So you can see how that would probably mess up your initial settings and would take you a lot longer, or maybe even some operators get confused of why they can't get their combine set to optimum performance. So I ran my harness bolts up so that my harness is up nice and tidy and out of the way, just like it was from the factory. And then I tightened up my safety bolts here. So I want to have the head down here against this bracket on both sides. And then I'm going to run this jam nut until that's good and snug. And then I'm going to bring the top jam nut down to lock it in place on both of them. But again, this is your safety. So if for some reason this motor gets removed, you shear this bolt and something doesn't get put back the way it was originally, these safety stops are going to make sure that that concave cannot go tight enough where it would actually get into those threshing elements on the rotor. So make sure that you do these, but this is the last step before you kind of put everything back together. Don't forget to put your grate back in and then put your rotor back in gear.
All right, so we've got our concave closed. Lucas showed us how we reset our jam bolts here, our stop bolts. We're still closed here on our worm gear. We're going to figure out what our true zero is. So on a round bar concave, we need to count down 13 bars from the top and put a ruler in between that 13th and 14th bar, and we're going to measure off to the leading edge of the threshing element. That's going to give us our true zero, or how much of a gap we have when we're at zero. That way, when we're setting our combine later, we know how much of tolerance stack up or how much of a nominal gap we have when our concave is fully closed. So Lucas is going to slowly spin the concave. We're just going to measure a couple in each. He's slowly going to spin the rotor. We're going to measure a couple elements from the 13th bar in each bay of the concave. We're just going to get an average, and then we'll know how big of a gap we have with our concave fully closed. So we're going to count down here. So we got our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So we're going to go behind that 13th element, and we're going to have Lucas spin it till we get close to one coming through. You got a ways to go, Lucas.
There, it's coming to you now.
Yep, all right. Just going to reach in there slowly, and the rotor's still in neutral. We should be able to turn this by ourselves now. We're right there at that top edge of that element, and we're going to measure to the outside of the concave bar. So we're about 20 millimeters. So we're going to measure a couple of them, and then we'll measure a thickness of a round bar, and then it will give us our nominal gap. So our second one we measured is at 18. So we're now going to measure one more in the front. So one in the front, we're at 21. So we got an average of, let's say, 19 or 20 millimeters. So now we're going to measure our width of our round bar in a couple spots, so we can subtract that from our 20. So we're about 16 millimeters on our round bars, so we're going to subtract that from our 20. We got 4 millimeters. So at our true zero that we mechanically set, we are a 4 millimeter gap. So later when we're in the field and we're measuring our cob size, we need to know that we have a 4 millimeter nominal gap prior to opening the concave.
Now one more thing that we need to do in the cab now is, now that we know that and we've got everything zeroed out, we've got our concave set where it should be for a mechanical zero, now we need to do the zero calibration in the monitor. So we'll go into our menu display, we'll go into our calibrations, and then we'll select our threshing clearance calibration. What that's going to do is it's going to open and close that concave, and it's going to get our sensor calibrated so that it knows where that zero actually is. But then keep in mind, like Chris said, we've got to go ahead and add that 4 millimeters. So if we're actually at 30, then we know that we're actually have a 34 millimeter gap.
All right, so we're going to put our separator gate back in, make sure we got our spacers in for corn and soybeans. We're going to tighten that all back up, and then we're going to go into the cab and do the calibration. So we just barely loosened up our bottom separator gate bolts. The separator gate's got two ears on it, so it just slides in those bolts. It makes it easier for installation. So now we're going to put the top bolts in the separator gate. All right, now we're going to calibrate our concaves. So get the key on. Machine should be off, just key on. So we're going to go menu. We're already over at machine settings. We're going to hit calibrations and procedures. And then we're going to hit threshing clearance calibration, STS electric. So we're going to hit calibrate. And we're going to hit start. Now the machine is automatically closing and decreasing, or closing and opening the concave. So now we're going to hit start calibration. All right, so it took a couple of minutes for the concave. A little electric motor had to work pretty hard, had to open it all the way up and then close it all the way up. So now we can save our calibration, and it's complete. So we're just going to go over here and hit save, and now we're done. Thanks for watching, coming out with us. today in our combine series. If you haven't done so, go back and watch some of our other videos, such as concave leveling, power shutdown, crop flow, combine settings adjust. Feel like there's a lot of valuable information out there we can share with you.
Yep. So again, thanks for watching, and we appreciate it. Again, if you got any specific questions, don't be afraid to call your local Sloan implement dealer. They can help you with any specific questions that you might have. And again, we wish you a safe and successful harvest.